The brain's very complicated, and in terms of what is Alzheimer's disease. So the brain changes of Alzheimer's disease start about 20 years before people have any symptoms. So by the time you start becoming more forgetful and having a decline in your function, this has been going on for a long time, and we know that by the time people have symptoms that they've had a lot of damage, unfortunately, to their brains. And it turns out that once the brain is damaged, it's very difficult to fix it.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell features guests each week to discuss prominent topics for those over 55. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. We have a guest today to talk to us about, I guess, what is the number one, is that fair to say, health concern for people as they age?
I would definitely say so.
It may not be the number one cause of death, but I would say it's the number one thing people worry about as they age.
That impacts your quality of life.
Yeah, and what I'm talking about is Alzheimer's disease. So we have an authority in this field. One of the advantages, incidentally, of being in St. Louis to do this show is that we have access to Washington University. And those of you who don't know, Washington University is probably one of the most respected institutions for research on the planet.
World-renowned.
World-renowned.
Hands down.
So we have access to these physicians and researchers who are the best in their fields and can tell us about cutting-edge things going on. So we've kind of levered those relationships, and we have on today a guest that I think you'll find very informative to talk about this topic. Why don't you do an introduction?
Yes,
Jill?
we have Dr. Suzanne Schindler. She's a neurologist with Washington University and a researcher. Dr. Schindler, thank you for coming on Life's Third Act.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Let me start by expressing a frustration about Alzheimer's research, is that I've got to where I'm not interested anymore. This isn't entirely true. I've gotten to where when I pick up a newspaper or go to a website, more likely, and I'm reading an article about something new on Alzheimer's, it generally relates to being able to diagnose it sooner or better. And I know that you're one of the best in the field regarding this, and this is an area we're going to talk about. But I still want to express the frustration that I'm wanting to pick up an article or to read an article about solutions. And instead, I'm hearing more about diagnosis. Now, I know you have to diagnose to solve, but it just seems that we're still short of the really exciting things in the field. Persuade me why what you're doing is going to be relevant to those of us who want to fix the problem, which I think would be everybody with it.
Yes. Well, first of all, I would say that I share your frustration because I see patients. And unfortunately, my patients with Alzheimer's disease, many times I see them once a year, and every time they come to see me, they're a little worse. And
right.
That's really a terrible thing for them and their family, but also for me as a physician, because it makes you feel kind of helpless that you can't make a change. And we're all working very hard and are very highly motivated to get to those treatments that you're talking about. So we're frustrated too, and we see I see patients every week that are just devastated by this disease.
But why is this so hard? Why is this so hard to move forward on? Explain a little bit about it.
Well, the brain's very complicated, and in terms of what is Alzheimer's disease. So the brain changes of Alzheimer's disease start about 20 years before people have any symptoms. So by the time you start becoming more forgetful and having a decline in your function, this has been going on for a long time. And we know that by the time people have symptoms that they've had a lot of damage, unfortunately, to their brains. And it turns out that once the brain is damaged, it's very difficult to fix it.
They're just too far gone.
In some ways, I hope that's not completely true. I think people who maybe present with the very earliest symptoms, we may be able to slow things down. But I think there is some truth to that by the time people have more advanced dementia, we just don't have the really ability. The brain has just been damaged kind of beyond what we can repair. But you were asking about or mentioning about diagnostics. So we've made tremendous advances in diagnostics, as you were mentioning. And Washington University actually developed the first blood test for Alzheimer's disease, which we are using sometimes now in select patients.
Why just in select patients?
Well, that's a really good question, too. At this point, it's because, there's a variety of reasons, but one is that insurance won't pay for it, and it costs $1,250. And really, the bigger reason is what you were alluding to initially, which is we don't have treatments. So if we do a test and it's positive, there's not necessarily something that I can tell you that would be different. So that makes it less compelling to spend that money to get a clear diagnosis. But I do think the diagnostics are really important, and this is why, because we are actually making a lot of progress on developing new treatments. And you probably heard about all the issues with the drug that was approved this last year, Aduhelm, which was highly controversial. I guess in a nutshell, the issue is that the drug company stopped the studies early because it didn't look like the drugs were working. And then when they came back, they're like, oh, maybe there's something there. But by that point, the study, really couldn't be performed as it should have been. And so it was really hard to interpret the results. And basically, we don't know whether the drug worked or not.
So this is the one that Medicaid has said it will only pay for people who are participating in experiments or
That's
studies.
Exactly right. Yeah. So they're only providing it for people who are in clinical trials because really we don't know whether it works or not in terms of providing a clinical benefit, so slowing down dementia symptoms. But there are several other drugs that are in late stages of clinical trials, and they look very promising. And I think the drug companies have had the advantage of learning from what happened to Aduhelm and aducanumab, and I think they will finish the trials and we will know whether the drugs actually work or not. So far, I think the data looks pretty promising, at least what they've presented.
Right. But the incrementalism, though, meaning a success or a win seems to be defined as an additional 6 months of life or maybe a year. You're not seeing the sort of wins you associate with a cure. Even if we don't use the cure, but 5 years, is substantial. But anything more than definitions of months.
Yeah, no, it's not very satisfying. And I think part of this is what we were talking about before, that by the time people have symptoms, that a lot of damage has been done. So I think as long as we're targeting people who already have symptoms, the best we may be able to do is to slow things down.
So this raises, though, this sounds like your best defense then for saying that I can diagnose very early, or I'm doing research that now allows us to diagnose very early that's a powerful argument if it means that you're fixable because we got to it early enough and
before there's much damage.
Yeah,
right.
And so you're.
That's exactly right. And so I think that the big cures that we want to see, I think they may not happen with people who already have symptoms. I think the big benefits that we may be able to achieve will happen when we can identify people who have early brain changes before a lot of damage has been done and start them on the medications before they have symptoms. And there are clinical trials going on right now that are doing exactly that. So they're taking cognitively normal older individuals and doing tests to detect the early brain changes of Alzheimer's disease. And if people have them, they're starting them on a drug. and then following them to see if that staves off dementia. And I think that is much more promising in terms of having a real benefit as compared to waiting until people have symptoms to treat them.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Except for the point that you just made. I would think that people who have this would not want a diagnosis. I'm sure some would, but I suspect a majority would not want a diagnosis, because all it means is that now you know where you're headed, and it's not a very happy situation. And so, what good does it do if it can't be treated? But again, the response to that is what you just said, where if it's caught early enough. But for those many who have symptoms, how many of them really want to know?
Well, and two, a lot of people might be blowing it off. Oh, it's just, short-term memory problem. It's not anything. We all, as we get older, we all, get forgetful. And they may blow it off that that's all it is and not realize it's something more serious.
But again, it doesn't matter if they blow it off unless it's early enough to do something about it. Is that what you're saying?
Actually, well, there's a number of issues. So something that's actually really important is that of the patients who come to see me who've typically had 6 months or more of consistent decline in their memory and thinking, that probably only half of them have a neurological condition. So many of them have things like sleep apnea, which can cause mild but very consistent declines in memory and thinking. Many of them are taking medications that impair cognition. And many of them have other medical conditions that can affect memory and thinking. So while I can't, at this point, cure Alzheimer's disease, a lot of my patients don't have Alzheimer's disease. They have other things that are affecting their memory and thinking. And so I can help them by diagnosing them with these other disorders, and we can often help with those. Now, the patients that do have Alzheimer's disease, you're right. So some of them don't really want a diagnosis because a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease carries a stigma with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other people who really want to know, and they really want to know because they expect that it will affect their future planning. Maybe they will move to live closer to their children, or they'll get a ranch house instead of a 2-story, or make other life decisions.
Yeah, I can see that.
What may happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really a tremendous range of whether people want to know or not.
Yeah.
And as a clinician, my job is to help people answer the questions they have. And so obviously if they don't want to know, then I wouldn't do specific testing for Alzheimer's disease. And if they really do want to know, I try to help them get an answer.
So when people think about aging and memory, of course, the big, bad, terrible thing in their mind is, of course, the possibility of Alzheimer's. But putting that aside for a moment, as you point out, there are lots of other explanations. Let's talk about other causes of dementia that may not be attributable to the specific things you mentioned. There are forms of dementia that are not Alzheimer's. Is there treatment for those? First of all, what are some of those things, and is there treatment for those?
Well, there's many, many other causes. Some that we see fairly frequently in our clinic are things such as vascular dementia. So people have had strokes in areas of the brain that affect their memory and thinking.
Okay.
If someone has strokes, then there are things that we do to prevent them from having future strokes. So, for example, we typically start them on an aspirin and a statin and look to see if they have problems with their arteries in their neck. So we can do other sort of interventions. There's also disorders such as dementia with Lewy bodies. And interestingly, dementia with Lewy bodies often responds quite well, at least initially, to a medication that we often use to treat Alzheimer's disease. So the medication is called donepezil. And many of my patients who have dementia with Lewy bodies have really had a marked improvement, at least for a couple of years when taking that medication.
And
What is
explain
that?
what that is.
Yeah.
I'm not real familiar with that.
Sure. So this is a medication that's been around for...
No,
the condition.
The disease you just...
I see. Dementia with Lewy bodies. So Alzheimer's disease is characterized by amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brain, but there's other neurological disorders that have other proteins in the brain. Dementia with Lewy bodies has something called Lewy bodies in the brain, and it can look quite similar to Alzheimer's disease in some cases. Many patients also have movement disorder symptoms similar to what you might see in Parkinson disease, and they often have problems with, they perceive it as problems with their vision. It can be a little bit more complex than that, but basically they can't figure out where things are at in space or see things the way they really are. And they sometimes have hallucinations. So they'll see animals or children who aren't there, and they really see them, and they can have other issues as well. But it can sometimes look like Alzheimer's disease, at least in the early stages. And so...
But it's more fixable.
Well, it responds to treatment, at least initially, but it is still a progressive neurological illness.
I'm curious, is it ever confused or misdiagnosed with schizophrenia? Because when you talk about seeing things that aren't there, that's a symptom. Does that ever happen?
So I suppose that could happen. Typically, people do not present with new hallucinations in their 60s or 70s.
That happens earlier in life if it's going to surface. Okay, gotcha.
But that's also associated with Parkinson's disease. Is that true?
Yes. So there is kind of a continuum between Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies. So Parkinson's disease is much more connected to movement abnormalities. So you think about the tremor and the rigidity and shuffling gait and falls, issues like that. And dementia with Lewy bodies overlaps with that, but it has more of the cognitive symptoms. So it can look more similar to Alzheimer's disease, but then it has these additional features of often hallucinations and some other issues.
So when you talk about things such as stroke, where there's damage to neurocells, I assume, I've heard much made about this thing called neuroplasticity, where apparently the brain has the ability to rewire itself. How much can it compensate for that damage? How much is realistic to expect?
So that's a great question, and it's really interesting. During a neurology residency, we see a lot of patients with strokes, and it's remarkable how people can have a stroke in one part of their brain, and that part of the brain is no longer functional. But you come to see them over a period of days to weeks, and oftentimes a lot of that function recovers because the rest of their brain is healthy. And it's kind of rewiring the functions that were previously in that area. Now, often that's not complete. So many stroke patients don't get back 100% of their function, but they often get back some and sometimes a lot. So it's very real, and we see it all the time following stroke, that people improve despite definitely having a significant area of brain damage. Now, I guess the question would be, why doesn't that happen with Alzheimer's disease? The problem with Alzheimer's disease is basically the whole brain is involved and sick. And so you just can't rewire as well.
When I read an article about the theory underlying some of these medications that were being developed, one theory seemed pretty sound to me, but it was greeted as a dubious idea. And that was that if you have a medication that prevents or even diminishes the plaque formation, that would solve the problem of of Alzheimer's, but that seemed to be treated with some skepticism. I thought it was apparent that the problem was the plaque. Is that not true?
Well,
The amyloid plaque, whatever it's called.
Yeah. So amyloid is necessary to cause Alzheimer's disease, but it's not sufficient by itself. And what I mean by that is if you don't have amyloid plaques in your brain, you don't have Alzheimer's disease by definition. But on the other hand, there are many people who have amyloid plaques in their brain, sometimes relatively high levels of amyloid plaques, but are still cognitively normal. Now, we know the higher the levels those get, the more likely you are to develop symptoms. But it seems that there are other things that are involved that lead to the symptoms. And I think that the amyloid by itself is bad for the brain, and it leads to kind of reactions.
Well, when you look at an image, I mean, it's so shocking. It's hard to imagine. It's like if somebody who's been smoking, they'd show you a picture of the lung and you'd say, obviously, that's bad.
Right.
And when you look at the pictures of the plaque of the brain, you think, well, gee, this must be obviously terrible for thought, for neurology, or no?
No, I think the plaques are definitely bad. And certainly we can see through lots of experiments in humans and mice and cells that the amyloid appears toxic. But then the response of the cells to the amyloid also kind of perpetuates a cycle of toxicity. So it's not just the amyloid, but it's the reaction to the amyloid that may cause some of the damage. I think that the reason why some people are skeptical of amyloid being the key feature of Alzheimer's is just because there are these people who have a lot of amyloid in their brain that are cognitively normal. So that's the primary reason for the skepticism. And there's also another protein that's important in Alzheimer's disease called tau. And it seems that tau, we're still trying to understand exactly what's going on with tau, but it seems that it misfolds perhaps in response to the amyloid plaques. And it occurs later in the disease, and it seems to be more associated with symptoms. So, it's just complicated. And whenever things are complicated, people kind of debate each other about what's the most important thing.
Now, I just want to know, does one's lifestyle, is there any connection with, who develops Alzheimer's? Like, say, someone that abused alcohol, drugs, their diet, smoking. Is there any thought about that?
Yes. So we know that people who have a lot of vascular risk factors, for example, that they are at higher risk for dementia, and not just Alzheimer's disease, but dementia from other causes like strokes as well. However, I see lots of patients who have lived very healthy lives who still end up getting Alzheimer's disease.
So is this an environmental component, or is it a genetic component that explains that situation?
So it's both. And certainly there have been many studies done of the genetics of Alzheimer's disease, and genetics does play a significant role. But there are other factors. Some of them are environmental, lifestyle factors, what other medical conditions you have, for example. But it's really the interaction of both. And then sometimes people get it even despite having no family history and a very healthy lifestyle. So bad luck.
So would you call it epigenetic? That's a phrase I hear a lot. Is that meaning that there has to be apparently the genetic potential, but it'll only occur if certain factors appear in their lives or circumstances?
I wouldn't say that it's that strong. I would say that genetics play as they're significant risk factors. But again, we find people who do not have genetic risk factors who get it. So it's an interaction of environment and genetics, and probably some things we don't totally understand.
Don't know.
Yeah.
What about, I've read studies that have suggested that people who are more educated tend to be less vulnerable to some of these cognitive challenges, forms of
Yeah.
dementia. What is that true, number one?
Doing things to keep your mind sharp.
Well, yeah. Well, let's first start with, is that true? But number two is, what would be the explanation? Would it be that these people who have college degrees, more fully develop their brains early on?
Yes, so there certainly is research supporting that idea that higher levels of education are somewhat protective against dementia. And we sometimes talk about this concept of cognitive reserve, which is kind of, I guess, like, and maybe in sports, being athletic, being in good shape. So if you are well educated, if you're cognitively active, that helps, and that potentially can help protect you to some degree from dementia. One other issue, though, is just that people might be kind of starting from a higher baseline level of function, and so, there's, I guess, a couple things that could happen. One thing is that they may have a lower tolerance for a decline. So some of my very highly educated patients come in with very mild symptoms, but it's a significant change for them. And then on the other hand, I have kind of other patients who have had a significant change, but because they're still able to do all of their activities, they haven't come in to see anyone. So people have very different kind of thresholds for when they seek care. But yes, in response to your question, I think that cognitive stimulation does help, and I always recommend that my patients remain cognitively active. And I think I definitely see a change since the pandemic started, where a lot of people have stayed home and not interacted with friends and family. And a lot of people who have not had interactions have really declined over the last couple of years, which is really unfortunate. So I'm trying to encourage people to try to start up their lives again. Obviously, the pandemic's been very difficult for older individuals because they've been at highest risk for getting severe COVID. So they've had to take precautions, but it's just had so many consequences for people in terms of activities and socialization.
Do you think that the socialization factor, which seems to be consistently pointed to as a very positive thing to ward off cognitive decline, some, I guess, it would suggest that has some emotional or psychological foundation. But I wonder to what extent, though, that it employs a range of the brain, of neural cells, or parts of the brain that are really more varied and diverse than, say, for example, a crossword puzzle. I mean, just being among people and dealing with the variety of things that is called upon for social interaction, does that employ perhaps more areas of the brain than sitting down and doing math?
I think that it can, yes. I mean, just having a conversation with the two of you, I really have to think hard about what you're saying and what I think about it. And, just having a conversation with people is quite a mental exercise. And I think crosswords are great, reading is great, but socialization is very stimulating to the brain.
Yeah.
And another thing about socialization and cognitive stimulation generally that it's important is novelty. So a lot of times people will do crossword puzzles, but they'll do one crossword puzzle for a day for years. And in a lot of ways, that's not as stimulating because it's the same thing they've been doing for years. And really something that stimulates the brain is doing something brand new that you've never done before and having
trying
a challenge.
New things, right.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't do that as much. And I think that's something that people might benefit from if they try new things.
Yeah, I wonder if there's an analogy to hormesis. I think that's what it's called. Are you familiar with that word?
No, I don't think.
I think it's where you shock the system and you do things that your body, these people who are longevity experts, which I kind of read a little bit about this topic, but they argue that by doing things that stun your body, like occasional fasting, like doing a physical exercise. It can even be true for people who work out in a gym, that what you described, doing the same exercise the same way for weeks, they complain was, gee, I'm seeing no physical response. And it's because of, maybe it's the same factors. And so when you shake it all up regularly and kind of shock the body, that it stimulates this response that you wouldn't otherwise get. It sounds like the same principle.
Yeah, and that's actually I'm not so familiar with that word, but we certainly have that principle in neuroscience generally. And so, for example, in stroke models, if you do kind of a mini stroke in an animal model and then a bigger stroke, the mini stroke can in some ways be protective. So your body kind of learns to adapt, I guess, and that can protect you from further insults. So yeah, but I do think that novelty is helpful. People tend to avoid it in some circumstances, but it may be a good thing to seek out if you really want to stay stimulated.
So is it possible do you believe, to slow down, putting aside medication, which we're all hopeful on the medication front that some miracle drug's going to come along, but what do you notice are the common denominators among those of your patients who have a dementia? Certainly we can talk about Alzheimer's, but maybe other dementias. What separates those who seem to last surprisingly long versus those who perhaps deteriorate more quickly? Is there a pattern between the longest lived or the best performing versus those who are least?
Yeah, I think there is. So I would say that probably the number one thing is family and social support, and just having someone that you live with who cares about you and make sure that your needs are met. That's hugely important. And then another factor is just general overall health. So in a lot of my patients who have dementia, obviously the dementia creates a lot of problems, but then they get secondary problems. So they have falls, they have urinary tract infections and other issues, and that really accelerates the decline. And then maybe a third factor would be more lifestyle factors like diet and exercise, level of activity, I think is really important. And many of my patients who do well, who have dementia but progress very slowly, they exercise daily, they eat a healthy diet, they interact with their family and friends frequently. So yes, I think there is a clear pattern. My patients that don't do as well are the ones who often don't have family support, who are in poor health, who unfortunately often sit in front of the TV all day, and they just do not tend to do well.
Do your patients tend to, maybe I should put it differently, do you tend to work cooperatively with a psychiatrist often to deal with patients who, I guess, not uncommonly may be inclined to depression or anxiety? Or do you fulfill that role?
So it's a combination of both. So if it's relatively easy to treat, then I will do it myself. And many of my patients have lower levels of anxiety or depression and often respond very well to first-line treatment with, for example, an SSRI type medication.
An antidepressant, you're saying.
An antidepressant. So, but especially my patients who have a long history of severe depression and anxiety. So it's been a factor their whole life. And now they have dementia on top of that. those are the cases where often it's more difficult to control their mood, and a psychiatrist can be helpful.
Dr. Schindler, I don't know if you saw that special that was done on Glenn Campbell several years ago. And, he couldn't remember what happened 5 minutes before, but he was still able to get out there and perform. And I've heard there is something about, the creative side of our brain, such, as music, that we don't lose that necessarily. How do you explain that?
Well, the brain is really an amazing thing. And I think that's very true, that there are certain abilities that in some cases we've really developed, whether it's singing, or some people can still play chess very well, even though they have severe memory problems, or cards. And for some reason, these abilities persist. And I don't know exactly why that is. I suspect that those areas that are involved in those tasks are spread out enough across the brain, or else they're somehow resilient to the effects of the pathology. But yes, it's quite remarkable that sometimes people who have really severe memory and thinking problems have retained, very specialized abilities.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder when I think about people who have, extraordinary abilities in very specific ways sometimes. And when I think of the chess guys, I think of some who I suspect were on the autism spectrum. Do you find that there's any correlation, positively or negatively, with, for example, autism or certain other conditions and the probability of Alzheimer's? No correlation?
I really haven't seen that. I have noticed that some of my patients who have a history of attention deficit disorder, sometimes they can kind of decompensate as they get older and maybe develop some Alzheimer's disease. And they were able to compensate before, so they had ADD and were able to compensate for many years. But it seems like at a certain point, they have more difficulty compensating and their ADD can get worse. But with respect to autism, other kinds of autism spectrum issues, I haven't really seen that as much.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could continue this conversation. I find it fascinating. I wish you were the bearer of more encouraging news in some respects. But as you point out, there's progress being made.
No, I think there's tremendous progress. I realize that it's not coming as fast as we would like, but compared to where we were just 20 years ago, we know so much more about the disease, and we're, I think, kind of right on the edge of having all these new treatments potentially approved and available. I think that we will very likely need to start being more aggressive with early diagnosis to really make use of them. But things have really changed tremendously over the last 20 years. And I'm really hopeful that in the next 5 years, things will change even more. I think things like the blood tests for Alzheimer's disease will really help to get people diagnosed more promptly. And that's going to be really important if we want to treat them with medications. And eventually, maybe 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we'll get to the point where people are screened for Alzheimer's disease when they're cognitively normal. And then if they're positive, they're started on a medication. So I think that's where things are headed. We still have a ways to go to get there, but I think we can see this.
So you would say that you're expectant that in less than 10 years, we will be able to treat effectively, meaningfully, people who are diagnosed early?
Well, I think that we will be able to diagnose people earlier and start people with early dementia symptoms on treatments. I think that will likely slow down the progression of the disease. But I think that the big game changer that we really all want, which is the end of Alzheimer's disease dementia, I think that will only come when we diagnose people before they have symptoms. And we're working on that, to diagnose people before they have symptoms and starting them on medications. But I think that's going to be where we make the big leap that we're all looking for.
And you think that'll happen in less than 10 years?
Well, I think it's possible. And I think that, there are drug trials right now going on that are working towards this. And I think, yes, I think it's quite possible. It's always hard to know before the drug trial's done whether it's actually going to work or not. But I think it's quite possible.
You don't inspire great confidence in your answer to that question, but I appreciate the fact that you're being brutally frank.
Well, I don't want to oversell it, but
it's okay to oversell.
I think there's reason, but I think there's reason for hope.
Yeah. Well, you're just a wealth of knowledge. We really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our viewers did well. We'll have to circle back, maybe in less than 10 years, but certainly in 10 years. Thank you. And I'm so impressed. You're not the first doctor we've had on, or researcher / doctor that we've had on from WashU, and as I said in the introduction, it's just really great to have people who are leaders in the field to come on and talk about this research. So we take advantage of it when we can. So we thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, and thanks for the great questions and conversation. It was gave me my cognitive stimulation for the day.
All right, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.